Welcome to Upside, where we dig into the real stories that live behind the headlines affecting European venture. Today we have a full house. We have Mads, Lomax, Andrew, and myself. And on the docket we're talking about robots. So no great surprise, Amazon is looking to replace humans with robots in their operations and facilities. So we're going to have a look at that, see how that affects Europe. Can AI spark the next industrial revolution for Europe? We are going to take a little bit of a squiz at that. And the UK government has launched some new AI initiatives, some sandboxing, some RIOs, So we're going to look at how will this new UK government initiative support startups and what we're doing with AI in this country. And then rolling back to Europe, we're going to have a look at the 28th regime, have a little update, what's going on with EU Inc., and see if we can get one single startup entity across Europe.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
So, gentlemen, how are you? Now, we are traveling Wilburys today. We've got Lomax, you've just come back from the States. How are you feeling?
I'm good. I'm great. We had a busy week last week as well. We had our founder retreat in Portugal. So we had 12 of the outsized founders spending high quality time here. So it's been a big 2 weeks.
Nice. What did you do? Was it surfing and stuff? Or what was the agenda?
We did some surfing, but we also did a big hike up a mountain. Nearly killed one of the founders, which was...
Yeah, don't do that.
I know. And we stayed in a nice quinta, as they say, a nice farm in Portugal.
Nice.
And had a really good time together, just away from laptops, phones, high quality.
No, what a lovely
stuff.
thing to do. And you're a bit red-eyed, aren't you? So I might have to poke you.
A bit red-eyed, but I feel good. I feel good. I'm good. I'm good.
Coffee it up to the max. Andrew, now you've gone the other way.
Exactly.
Now you're over in SF. What's happening with you, dude?
It's good. Just rekindling keeping my network alive over here. Meeting people. Some of our startup founders are obviously West Coast as well, so I've got dinner with them tonight. It's great to be back here. COVID kind of killed my regular. So I used to live here, but COVID killed my regular trips, and so I'm trying to get back into the saddle.
Nice. And Mads, you and I in Blighty. What's happening with you, my good man?
Well, I'm just back from Munich, Germany. Saw some good people there from various investors, allocators. Yesterday, I'd been invited to speak at a conference, which I did, and it was very good. We talked about AI, business transformation, industry.
Did you do defense?
Do you know what? We didn't talk much about defense.
What?
It was much more about automotive and how to make all the good things that Europe has always been good at making. How can we do that sort of in the next industrial revolution, which I think we're also going to talk about today. So all very exciting.
Yeah, we are. We are going to get to that. To start with, we're going to look at Amazon. So they plan to replace more than 500,000 jobs with robots. And so when I saw this headline, I was thinking, what's going to come to Europe? What's already here? How is this all going to fit together and affect our world? But on the Amazon piece, they're looking to cover 75% of US operations with robots by 2033. Now, a 5-year-old study, so it's quite an old study, but looked at the US that suggested that for every robot installed in manufacturing, 5 humans were displaced. However, there's more to that story than meets the eye. Looking to Europe, the CEPR report covering Europe suggested that 25% of all jobs are going to be significantly disrupted by AI and automation, so no great surprise. However, their conclusion was, and this is a more recent report, that it's not going to lead to mass unemployment, more of a shift of employment. So when we get there, gents, I'd like us to touch on some of these things. Now, looking at the specifics around how much has Europe automated, I looked to Germany and specifically into automotive. And I didn't know that 80% of automotive assembly in Germany is already automated. I shouldn't be surprised by that, but I thought it might be a little bit less, but more than 80% is already automated. Now, for context, Germany is possibly the only developed economy to maintain a strong manufacturing base, as everybody normally moves into services over time. However, 20% of their GDP is manufacturing, and I would suggest that with this defense push, we're going to see even more. So many questions around this. Is it a good or a bad thing that manual labor is being replaced? how much of this approach will enable or unlock Europe, specifically Germany, seeing they are possibly the largest manufacturing base. How else can we lean into physical AI? So lots of questions. Mads, can I start with you? Maybe on a bit more of a tee up of what's going on with robotics.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a bit of Groundhog Day. This is the conversation we've been had since the automated looms and the Luddites, isn't it? Sort of for hundreds of years, we've been talking about how automation is displacing workers. And yes, I think that's true. Automation will change jobs and will automate some jobs, and new jobs will be created. And it was more or less ever thus. If we look at Amazon, I think what they've said is it's not so much about replacing jobs. This is about growing without increasing headcount. So I think they've said no layoffs, but they plan to double sales towards 2033, but without hiring more people. And so what does that mean?
You would say that, wouldn't you?
Well,
Yeah.
they would,
that.
but that's also, sure, but I think that's been, to a large extent, some of the trajectory they've been on, right? It's not as if they've already automated a lot, but it's not as if they have no headcount today. And they've been investing significantly in robotics. I think the cost savings they've been talking about over the last few years is more than 12 billion, just sort of, over the last 2 or 3 years alone. And some of the productivity gains are real if you look at what they've created in their logistics facilities. So you're talking about, a decade ago, an employee would process 175 packages, but today that's 3,870. So sort of a 22-time increase. And that productivity gain, of course, is what creates a wealthier society, right? That's how we make the GDP grow, by having productivity growth go up. So I think there's a lot happening there. They were out early. They bought Kiva Robotics. And rather than then starting to remarket that to others, they've just integrated and said, look, we are going to use that for our own business to become more effective. In Europe, we've got companies like Swisslog and KUKA and Dematic that are selling automation solutions. So that's more of a making technology for others. And, there is, as you say, Dan, there is already a lot of automation, but there's also a lot that isn't automated yet. According to DHL data, more than 80% of European warehouses are still manually operated. So there's so much more we can do using AI. We made some investments in that area, and there are many companies that are developing new technology. I think this whole physical push is it's so exciting because there's so much we can do. And it's clear that if we don't, the Chinese are going to do it, whether we do or not. So I think we sort of, the choice we have is, do we want to get on the train and automate and become more efficient? Or do we want to try and sit back and wait at the risk of just being totally displaced from a productivity perspective and not being competitive on anything?
Lomax, what else is going on in Europe? So I think
the biggest context piece to set is that over 31 million people in Europe, in the EU, work in the manufacturing sector as of last year. This is the largest employment sector in the EU. So it's ahead of wholesale and retail trade, human health, social work, except like big areas of employment like government work. So this and the numbers are much, much lower in the US because, for reasons you outlined earlier, the US has offshored a lot of its manufacturing.
But it's all going back, baby, because Trump's going to make America great again.
That's the plan.
By building iPhones in the States for $25,000 a seat.
But Germany, the biggest economy in Europe, has retained still a very heavy manufacturing base. So the answer actually is, if you were looking at it from an investor or a tech perspective, like there's a lot of effectively jobs to automate, as it were. There's still a lot of manufacturing done here, and so there's lots of improvements that can be done. And you looked at, Mads just quoted in the context of Amazon, some of the productivity gains that you can get. Then these are quite staggering. But clearly, we then start to move into the realms of like quite big social political upheaval, right? Like all of these people obviously have families, they vote, what happens to these people? I mean, if you take Amazon, for example, Amazon actually said in the EU that they plan to invest. Well, this is just a small example, but they are planning to invest more than 25 million into upskilling European employees in 2026.
But how much do you buy, Lomax? How much do you buy into the shift in employment rather than the replacement of employment? Because this was another thing that came out in a number of the reports where they were looking at, we are still going to need, not humans in the loop, but the equivalent of, where they just need to be looking after the robots and building and support. So how much do you buy into what's going to shift and what's going to be displaced? Where's the cleanliness?
Well, I think there'll be a mixture, and I think that per like what we talked about with Amazon, where Amazon gradually stops hiring and for new jobs as the business grows, quite dramatically, actually, still, quite frankly, then new work coming online could be done by robots. But let's not forget that Europe is growing nowhere near. Many companies in Europe, especially old manufacturing companies, are not growing, right? So it's not like they can lean into the new growth by hiring.
Yeah, a lot of the good stuff does depend on the fact there's going to be mega growth.
I think I'm completely struggling with this, coming from smart people like you. I mean, it's exactly the opposite. The reason Amazon can grow the way they do is because they're running a bloody good business, because they're automating.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the whole point is the reason we're not growing is because we're not investing, because we're not automating, because we're not competitive. The reason the German automotive sector is being hammered is because the Chinese have stolen the march on us in terms of tech and automation. So they can produce cars that are really, really good, a lot cheaper.
I know, but Mads, come on. I mean, the Chinese government is subsidizing the automotive industry in China. So I don't know how you compete with that. I mean, they're shipping a BYD equivalent of a Model 3 over here for like $16,000. Sure, tariffs and everything else, but that's just nuts. I mean,
I think you'll find that a lot of that subsidy talk is sour grapes. I think you'll find that, yes, of course, there's been industrial policy there, just as there has been in Europe and elsewhere. And possibly the Chinese have been a little bit smarter at it the last 10 years. But no, I don't think you can chalk all of this just up to subsidies. So Lomax, just finishing that, you've looked at economies that have tried that, right? Who are the world champions at subsidies? The French. Okay? Every time you buy a Peugeot, the French government will subsidize that to the tune of $5,000.
Yeah, but we've all done it. Every government has done it, haven't they?
Well, until recently, the 60% of the European budget went on the common agricultural policy and went to French farmers. I think it's down at 35% now. 60% of the entire budget until about 5 years ago or something. It was insane.
But French food is
the
good.
Entire budget being handed to French farmers. It is. I mean, the cheese isn't as good as British cheese. I still say that, but
what the 65 types of cheddar we have at the supermarket?
Don't knock cheddar. We're not having that conversation, Matt.
I can't believe we've gone from subsidies to cheese. Andrew, carry on.
The robot stuff's interesting because when you look at if you look at robots deployed as a function of actually employees in manufacturing, then Europe doesn't look so bad. I think we're at sort of 220 robots per 10,000 employees. Asia's just under 200. The US is just under 200. The difference is the growth rate and deployment rate of robotics. I think the year before last, I was reading some data that Asia, 70% of all newly deployed robots were installed in Asia. I think it was about 17% in Europe and 10% in the US. So that trend line is not looking good for Europe. But then, of course, Europe's overall GDP is under 20% for manufacturing, for heavy manufacturing. So the impact on GDP won't be as great, but no question that where robots building cars and building other manufacturing devices start, where will we end? We'll end up with robots in the home, whether we like it or not. So I think to be behind on that growth curve is a bit of a problem. And, we've got to keep up with the Joneses. So robot density per employee in manufacturing, Europe's actually pretty good, if not the best of those three big regions currently. But we need to keep that trend line going. And there may be a bigger issue as well, which is more just the fact that, where is the European Amazon? That's the bigger question. I mean, as Mad says, Amazon's built an amazing business. And what underpins that is huge efficiency gains. And so if that's robots, they'll do whatever they need to do to create efficiency gains. But the bigger question is, where is a company approaching retail in the same way that Amazon is on that scale?
Well, I am very naughtily conflating two topics, really. One is the human element and the other is the commercial element. And maybe that's not a healthy way of having this debate. But I don't see how you can't not think of, to Lomax's point, the voting employee and and the struggle. If this is pure displacement, there's going to be trouble at mill.
It's a lot hard. This is. I mean, again, not to be too always to be so down on Europe, but Europe does have big constraints here. It's like don't forget the labor laws. We haven't even talked about them today. But in China, you guys read that article in the Telegraph last week about Western CEOs coming back from China in a state of cultural and technological shock, right? Cultural and technological shock is the words that they used, looking at the proliferation of robots. I think 300,000 industrial robots in Chinese factories compared to 34,000 in the US and 2,500 in the UK, just as an example. That can be done in China in a way that cannot be done in Europe, because to replace a large part of the employment of the employees in these factories is basically impossible.
Well, I mean, that's almost a similar argument with the rare earths, which we nearly spoke about this week, where it's such a dirty, carbon-intensive process. We've just put our green hats on in Europe and then shoved everything over into China and are now paying the price. So, I mean, I'd like to know in China how the working population is, how that compares to the robotics, because they would obviously be a great use case to look at their workforce and what has been replaced by robots in their workforce. I dare say we'll never see those figures. But let's stay with AI. Go on, Mads.
Yeah, no, I saw
the face.
Well, I mean, I just think, sure, fine. We've had a super cushioned existence for many years, right? I mean, it's kind of, we've talked about this notion of outsourcing our defense to the US, right? And our energy to Russia and our manufacturing to China. We could send all the dirty stuff over there because we didn't really want to touch it. And coming from a position where we were wealthy enough and rich enough and had enough advantages built in that we could sort of live off the past and, sort of live off the principle as opposed to the growth and the interest. And those times are up. And I think to some extent, as investors and technologists, we are not going to be able to fix all problems of society. It's our job to show the solutions, to show that there is a way technologically and to fund and, finance those entrepreneurs that are going to build it and make it happen. We're going to have to work with the rest of society to, fix some of those wider issues you guys talk about. One thing's for sure, without the technology, without the founders, without the will to try and build some of these things and make it happen, it's going to go down the drain. I mean, there's just no way we can afford the European welfare state 20 years from now without dramatic reform.
Yeah, and let's not forget, the backdrop to this as well. We have aging societies, and we have societies that want to cap significantly low-skilled immigration, right? And I don't think those things are going to change anytime soon. So this is undoubtedly part of the solution. It's not overnight. And quite frankly, you can talk about labor unions in Germany or France, but actually by the time you kind of ramp up, we're looking at a lot of the new robot companies are still very, very early on in their journey, right? So I think there's going to be this gradual, I don't think it's like a rip out overnight. It's a gradual evolution.
Sure. I think it's going to be a little bit more, apart from the SMEs, obviously the smaller businesses obviously can't afford to take on this kind of tech, but I think for the large, it might be a bit of a quicker transition. But let's stay on this. Listen, I mean, I was reading this week from John Thornhill. He wrote an article, "Can AI spark a second industrial revolution in Europe?" So this is quite a timely segue for us. He unpacked some of the recent Nobel Prize awarded work looking at economic success derived from human capital, entrepreneurship and innovation, all the stuff you were talking about, Mads. And he asked the question, does Europe have the capacity to absorb and profit from AI specifically? So my question to the room is very generalistically, do we? I mean, how do you answer that question, Mads? Kick that one off.
I think it's interesting that we are going back to the Nobel topic we discussed last week. It is probably quite relevant, right, in many ways for many of the things we're talking about. Masukir, he won the Nobel for explaining the success of the Industrial Revolution. And he pointed out kind of there are two things that are important. It's not just about the inventions themselves, and sort of the diffusion of knowledge into society, kind of new ways of doing things. It's also about having the institutional capacity to absorb that knowledge. And that's super interesting I think, in the context of another article you shared, which is kind of this wide discussion of why are there so many of the AI implementation projects that are failing? Right? AI has got this tremendous potential. We can all see it. Yet when you look at enterprise adoption, we know that so many of the projects that have been kicked off, they don't succeed. And in many ways, when you look at innovation traditionally in new technology, the adoption would have been more gradual, more slow, and you would have been able to develop the institutional capacity to implement, to use, to benefit from that technology gradually. But ChatGPT launched less than 3 years ago. We're still so early. And without the knowledge of how to make these projects successful, without the skills to create the data structures and the integrations that are needed, organizations, they're just not ready, and the projects, they fail. And so, I think these things we're talking about here are very closely linked. The fact that AI projects are failing is not because the technology isn't incredibly powerful. It's because we are seeing something that has such big potential that everybody is running to adopt at the same time before we have the institutional knowledge, the skill, the experience, the battle scars to implement it successessly. We've had some
bad thing, Mads, is it? I mean, this is
not a
going
bad
to be
thing
a
at all.
circular effort, right? They're in it.
100%. No, but there's sort of been a bit of doomerism around AI, saying, is it really all that? No, I think it's absolutely all that. We've had analogies. If you look at the early implementations of ERP, SAP, for example, a classical enterprise technology, had a 50 to 75% failure rate in early implementations. And that was not with sophisticated AI. I mean, that was just ERP. Big companies like Little, they spent more than 500 million euros over 7 years before abandoning their SAP project. And there are many others like them. So I think it's the same thing we're seeing here. Enterprise adoption of new technologies is much harder than people think, and it's going to take time to develop the skills to get this right. And that's fine, right? That's why we're not seeing everybody go from 0 to 100% AI overnight. To Lomax's point, there is a gradual implementation.
But I think it's incredible how fast people, or all of the lawyers we speak to, know that they're going to be disrupted. Even the lawyers are on it. And I think there's obviously a generational aspect to this where we are much more technically savvy. The people that are in positions of power across large organizations, much more tech savvy. But I just find like ed tech, law, health, all of these industries that are quite laggard or have been, some of them are, they're all having a pop, and I think it's great. I think it's going to be a circular play. But Andrew, you're in the center of the universe of all this stuff. What would you point at?
I think Mads is right on enterprise deployment specifically. Vendors tend to overpromise and underdeliver. Organizations are still made up of people ultimately, and unless you get buy-in from the stakeholders within the organization, then these projects can fail. And also, they've got to have an understanding. They've got to have the training. I think less than 10% of budgets tend to go on the training. And the sort of human element of change in a large organization when these programs are rolled out, and that's just a recipe for disaster. So you throw in perhaps a lot of siloed systems or data, poor data quality, the classic unclear ownership of outcomes which you get in enterprise, and that makes for a hell of a ball of string to untangle. So I think it will happen, but it's going to be slower, and we're still in the hype cycle. And I think some organizations have been either been over enthusiastic to adopt and then struggled to make things work, especially those that are not sort of tech first organizations, like the FANGs, or they've gone the opposite way and they've sort of just they've been overly hesitant and not adopting and not really understanding how AI can help them. And we've certainly seen that some of our portfolio companies that sell into enterprise, the education cycle for companies and as part of the sales cycle has been a lot steeper than some of them have guessed it would be.
I think they're also maybe working out where they focus. Do they look at their internal efficiencies, or do they look at their product and customer facing stuff, or do they do both buckets? AI is obviously not just one aspect in one part of the business. It could be everywhere. So maybe there's a understanding contextually where to focus. But Lomax, what?
And just to one other point, I mean, the cultural fear, I don't think should be underestimated, because you see it, things that hobby horses we've touched on where we know that AI deployed well would be transformative, such as the NHS. Again, we've seen the biggest friction to adoption of technologies from the people, because they fear job loss, they fear loss of autonomy. So, the NHS's biggest problem, as an example of an enormous organization, has always been the ownership of people's little, fiefdoms within the organization, and getting those fiefdoms to work together. And compromise has generally been the biggest barrier to ensuring that operating rooms are always full or equipment is always being utilized. It's not actually because there aren't solutions there, it's because people get in the way. And so until you have the political will or the leadership that has the clout to force people to make decisions and to compromise, then you're always going to be stuck. And that can happen with enterprise, right? If you don't have a leader who has the skills to get his division heads and other people, and can't bring the board and everybody else with them to force change, then it doesn't happen efficiently. And that's certainly true in the NHS, because the CEOs of hospitals, these hospitals, aren't CEOs. They're administrators. They have no control over the anaesthetists. They can't order the surgeons to do anything. They can't order the nurses to do anything. So it's not really a CEO role. So I think those the biggest places where you'll see societal impact from AI. We need to unravel the human factor. It's not the technology that's the problem, actually.
Yeah, no, it's usually the human that's the weakest in the loop. But I mean, Lomax, let's go back to the question. Does Europe have the capacity? Maybe focus on the UK. Does the UK have the capacity to absorb and profit from AI?
Well, I mean, it definitely has the capacity to absorb and profit from AI, for sure. I mean, one of the questions I think in this article that you quoted from John Thornhill in Sifted is around, can AI spark a second industrial revolution in Europe? If you include physical AI, robotics, as we were talking about earlier, within all of this, I think the answer is very much yes. So you have the disruption that you get from AI and LLMs of knowledge workers and white collar workers. I think you kind of referred to it, Dan, a bit earlier, as sort of lawyers and doctors. No one's losing their job overnight with these things,
Yeah.
Well,
it's mainly co-piloting, isn't it? It's mainly enabling you. There's a slight Jevons paradox-esque, perhaps, aspect to this, where I can just do more, I can serve more, but that does depend on, a level of growth. But yeah,
I think the real, to be honest, I mean, we talked about China earlier. I think the real kind of, if you industrial revolution, if you picture it, like you go back to the original industrial revolution, China is the place where the real sort of industrial revolution is going through now. And we just talked about, the Western CEOs coming back shocked from seeing the factories that they have.
They were living under a bed somewhere. I'm sorry. If they didn't know what was going on, then more fool them.
Yeah, but I think, and then tying into what Mads said and Andrew was saying, actually, probably, thankfully, the change is not overnight. The sort of the technological change is quite significant in sort of isolation, but actually the adoption is quite slow. And I think that's actually important, because don't forget that seeing as we're talking about industrial revolutions, and I don't want to get into sort of too broader sort of sweeping historical narratives here, but the Industrial Revolution threw up a huge societal political change, right? And so, in a way, society needs to get ready for this. And so, if you take the industrial, the original Industrial Revolution, for example, the British income per person roughly doubled from $400 to $800 from 1760 to 1860. So it doubled. But actually, if you look at the inequality rose, right? Which is actually one of the fears around AI, right? Is that you will end up with a broader inequality in society, and bad stuff can happen from that. Like if you go back to history, you can be like, we had revolutions off the back of the Industrial Revolution. The welfare state didn't kick in to sort of mollify the effects of this until, after the Second World War. So all of these things that ended up being sort of necessary to, I would say, rebalance society after what happened with the Industrial Revolution, it kind of needs to happen again. We talk about universal income, these kind of things. So I'm kind of glad, actually. So going back to John Thornhill's article, the real Industrial Revolution is happening in China at the moment. The US, Europe is third, definitely in that tier. It's a very slow burn if you're looking at it as an Industrial Revolution, but sure.
Revolution is a romantic word. It sort of conjures up, fast, speedy, impactful change.
Yeah, you're right.
And one of the problems is that we started with a blank sheet to some degree. If you think about the key pillars of the original industrial revolution, is energy, basically transition. So from animal and water power to coal and steam. It was transportation from horseback to canals, railways, steamships, and it was, I suppose, sort of institutional. So think about things that were put in place that allowed the whole shebang to accelerate. So patent laws, banking system, trade associations, or organized capital. It's a bit of a tired trope to say industrial revolution now, because first of all, is it a sort of 10x, 100x better solution? And AI in niche sort of applications arguably is, but it's not that. It's not that foundational yet. It's not that foundational sort of sweeping change where you go from a horse to a train until it's deployed in the organization. Yeah, overnight, exactly, and that's the key, because you're not working with a blank sheet. You've got a huge amount of friction to deploying this stuff and getting it working, and you've got a huge amount of friction to making the changes and unwinding a lot of the institutional, regulatory, cultural issues to change from how we do things today, which is already complex, to doing things far better, but in a completely different way. And I think that's where the analogy falls down a little bit. So ultimately, looking back, I think we'll look back and go, yes, AI was a revolution. What the inflection point will be? Is it now the start, or is this now the efficient? I can't remember the steam engines. There was a steam engine that was highly inefficient, and then someone fixed it. I can't. My history doesn't serve me well, but it took a while before it actually really ran away.
It was the rocket, wasn't it? Wasn't it the first one?
Well, that was the train, yeah, but there was a problem with the steam engines.
I think you're absolutely right. There's going to be lots of friction. There's going to be lots of issues. But the challenge is, coming back to some of these luxury beliefs, is that we have time to, really give them, decades to play out. I think if what we do is lean back and say, look, we're going to have a long time to figure this out, steady she goes. China is going to race so fast. We're going to be so far behind that we're going to have a completely different conversation. Imagine a world where Europe can no longer make any automotive that's competitive in any category. What will that do for societal upheaval when all the German automotive companies are bankrupt, when the whole automotive supply chain is gone? Right? And so I think to some extent we're sitting around, we're talking about how we need to do this gradually and gently so that we, people don't, and all this stuff. Yes, that's true. The challenge I have with it is we're now living in a context where there is a real competitor. It's not like the UK where there was no real competition and the UK could take a little bit of time to figure this out. The competition is there and they're running fast.
Right. We just learn Mandarin.
And I don't think people don't feel the people don't feel the fire. Interestingly, we're chatting to one of, this is slightly tangent, but it's the same point. Biotech, right? If you look at, if you take biotech as an example now, there's a general consensus now. So US has always been a leader generally in biotech, right? There's a large consensus from chatting to a biotech founder in our portfolio last week, spending quality time with him. He just spent time in the US, there's a consensus amongst the US, and Eric Schmidt put out an article in Time about 6 months ago about this, that actually China is leading in biotech now. Having gone from nowhere in like 7 years, is now the leading, like in terms of new therapies, in terms of new tools. And so in terms of CROs, like all the big CROs now are generally there. So I think just that's a small example of like a really important foundational technology where China is just, we can navel gaze, but China is just cracking on ahead.
I think you can argue that for many sectors, Lomax.
Well, I mean, we just talked about it in the context of AI and robotics, yes. But I'm talking about core, like foundational sectors, yeah.
Yeah, I think also we just don't see, or the Western media doesn't show what's going on the ground in China. So I just don't think it's in our faces. But my sense is
I think Matt is right. Like people in Europe don't feel the fire underneath them at all, and so it's going to be a bit of a wake up call.
I mean, to some extent, the age-old discussion between employers and trade unions is fine, right? You're discussing how to share the cake, right? There's a nice baked cake. How do we share it? And my worry is that as we sit around and pontificating on how to share the cake and how can we best look after everybody, the cake's going to be gone.
Eaten.
Yeah, the Chinese will have eaten it. There won't be any cake.
Have your
because
cake
there is a
and
way
eat
there is
it.
a way to share productivity gains with employees. It doesn't all need to accrue to the equity holders, or
Of course.
there is a way to make this work.
Matt is touching on the key point, which is the original industrial revolution was mechanizing muscle, and now we're really mechanizing minds, and the minds are in the heads of people. And so one of the reasons China can do things so quickly is because they ride roughshod over the opinions of many. If the great red state decides it wants to build an airport, it does it. And so when we're thinking about how quickly we can keep up, precisely to Matt's point, if we're still arguing over how the cake is shared and what we shouldn't do and who it's going to annoy and Lomax's favorite NIMBYs, then I mean that's the friction here. It's not technological capability or capacity. It's the societal ability to absorb the change and for people to make unpopular decisions, or unpopular with some people, so that we can.
But we do.
keep up.
There is a care of duty as well. We do have to. I don't know how you do it, but we do have to find a balance, which is also looking after people. I think it's important. So I don't
But
think
longer term, but you can turn that around and say the longer term you're neglecting care by trying to pretend the change isn't happening. Like, you're not stopping AI, and it'll be, if you get left behind, you can either be in control of the pain and manage it proactively, and then benefit from not being left behind, or you can be reactive and be left behind, and then the pain's worse, and you've still got to deal with all the same pain anyway.
You need technologically literate politicians, because actually, they don't understand. No, not technocrats. No,
we haven't even got business literate politicians. Let's get some commercially literate politicians.
Lomax is right.
Because actually go back to the Industrial Revolution. You had the communist revolutions in the wake of that, right? And actually, you know what? If we fuck this up, like if we fuck up AI and robotics, like you do end up with like social upheaval. You do. This is why, like politicians actually hate AI. It's like, no, they can't put that. Some of them do. They put their head in, and they're putting their head in the sand. You need people who actually can see across the big picture and to navigate this, because it's a big change.
There's a great example of this, which is Estonia, which is Thomas Hendrik. I mean, before he was president, he was a software programmer. And he is the reason why Estonia has now got, it's fully digitized. It's got, you can be a digital Estonian citizen.
Yeah, one of the fastest growing economies in Europe.
Yeah, exactly, because he had a digital vision. He had the Tiger League project.
Sorry,
when people understand, you can't do this stuff and be visionary about it if you don't understand it, to Lomax's point.
Well, let's lean into what the UK is doing. So the UK this week has launched a couple of initiatives. One, which is this AI Sandbox, which is working out how to. I don't know how we really unpack this, but it's from Liz Kendall, wasn't it? She was at the Times Tech Summit this week, and she's the technology secretary. I think also the MP for Leeds, I think. But anyway, somebody can correct me on that. So she's announced plans to look at how established companies and startups can test new AI products in the real world. Some rules and regulations will be temporarily relaxed. And I got into a big fat debate with some investors and founders this week, which was basically them against me. And one of their kind of framings was, well, this is just like the FCA sandbox, which actually led to a lot of good things where startups and businesses could play in a relatively free environment to get new financial services to market quicker. And I was saying, well, this isn't financial services. This isn't fintech. This is AI. And also the UK isn't the same place as it was 10 years ago. This is a very different realm, a very different financial and commercial situation we're in, I think. So I was saying pretty much along the lines of what we've been talking about. We need to approach this very differently. So am I right? Am I wrong? How could this work? What should the outcomes be? Where do we focus? Mads, kick this off with maybe looking at the FCA sandbox and what that was.
Yeah, absolutely. So the FCA sandbox worked because when you launch a financial services company or a fintech, you need authorization to operate. So you can't launch a challenger bank or a payment service or any of these fintechs without regulatory approval. And then the sandbox provided a faster pathway to get the regulatory approval and sort of solve some of these gatekeeping issues to make it easier to enter into experiment, which was great because that's what you need in sort of a highly regulated industry. Now, AI as an industry isn't gatekept. So that, Meta, Google, Anthropic, they're all deploying AI at massive scale with no special permissions. You don't need an authority to authorize you to deploy AI. So that begs the question, what barriers are actually being removed? And, I think the key place you can look to is the NHS. You've got an absolutely massive diagnostic backlog there. You've got more than 1.5 million people waiting for diagnostic tests. And you have almost 400,000 people that are waiting for more than 6 weeks. Now, the standard or the target is to get down to less than 1% of people waiting for that long, but it's now almost a quarter of people that wait for more than a month and a half. And so, one of the things we've talked about before here is, could we make a healthcare opt-in model work where you said to people, look, maybe this technology hasn't been tested for 3 years, but if you opt in, we're going to give you an experimental diagnostic. And if there is an issue, if something that props up, we're going to have a radiologist check it and make sure that it's okay. And that could be a way to deploy AI more quickly to address a specific issue around wait lists and give people some flexibility and sort of not lowering the regulatory hurdle. You're still going to go through a process, but making sure we can deploy AI more quickly. So it would be a very, very different thing from what we saw at the FCA Sandbox, but it could potentially be something that could work.
That was something that I suggested in the debate that I was having. Is I think this is a great thing if it was ring-fenced even further, and I use the NHS as an example, because I get that also government and officials need to see the real world operating so they know and have the insight into how that private market is going to behave in the real world. So I kind of get it from that perspective as well. But Lomax, what would you add or change or debate?
No, I think it's good. As in, it's not a straight analogy from the FCA Sandbox, but it is a sandbox of sorts. Of like, if there is a streamlined way in a way, it's more of a streamlining of procurement processes, which it was different for FCA Sandbox was as a sort of simplification of the regulatory rules. This is a procurement, a streamlining and simplification of the normally onerous government procurement.
But that's only on one side of the equation, right? So this is only how government can buy and operate. So that's
yes.
another way. That's another way of ring fence. Anyway, I interrupted you. So no, you carry on.
Just for example, no, I slightly. If you look at the NHS, for example, which is basically 20% of government spending, and is a large proportion of GDP, is how can we, if we want to maybe have two aims, let's say the one aim is to create homegrown technology champions from the UK, and at the same time is have the NHS benefit from this technology, then the sandbox in this case is, I think, lighter. You could have a lighter regulatory burden, but that can be quite tricky in healthcare. But you certainly can have a streamlined procurement process and be like, look, we're going to test this out in this subset of NHS trusts. I actually, with Mads, is what Mads is saying is, I personally think my instinct is the sort of low-hanging fruit with LLMs in particular is around the administration of healthcare, not the actual diagnosing and treating of patients. Because you talk about AI, radiologists, whatever, that's actually not LLMs, but it's just like, that's also hard because then you're getting into like giving clinical, it's like, that actually for me needs to be a relatively high. I personally wouldn't be shortcutting too much the regulatory process for those products. Although in the US you have it, it's called the therapeutic use exemption. So in the US where you have an area of particular acute need with like lack of current standard of care, in the US you can get fast tracked. So we could have something like that, which we probably already have in the UK.
You'll probably know who this company is. I'm sure it was this week, a diagnostics startup had raised, I think, in the hundreds, maybe 200 million Series B.
Good for them.
To effectively what sounded like becoming It had absorbed all of the doctors, journals, all of the information. And I cannot for the life of me remember what the name of the company was, but it felt like that was not just on the operational side, but it was actually client-facing diagnostics. Do you remember who that was? Did you see that?
I don't recall. There are a few companies doing that, but yeah, it kind of consolidates your EHR, etc. But I personally think it's even just like cutting waiting list times to do administration of healthcare. There's sort of, you can predict if someone, for example, this is very simple stuff, but you can use AI to predict how likely someone is to miss their appointment, for example, depending on what time the appointment is, how far they live from the hospital, and putting in place processes to make sure that they get a series of reminders, etc. And that
can I ask you a question, Lomax?
Sure, tell me.
Do you need an AI sandbox to implement that?
So I would call it a sandbox, because normally to sell that kind of product, which is probably a medical device, or into the NHS, it takes years. You want it, so I would create a whether you call it an AI sandbox, I don't know, but it's a sandbox to effectively allow these products to have access and get real use case, get the products into the hands of people as soon as possible, for sure. Then
we've just come down from an AI sandbox kind of more general to an NHS one to a procurement one within the NHS. I don't know where using these as examples.
If it's AI in the NHS, sure, and if it's you could sandbox it in other areas, but I mean, maybe sandbox is the wrong word.
Well, it feels like we're just educating some grey hair to be able to make smarter, quicker decisions, which just feels a little bit weighty when we should be focusing elsewhere.
It's just much too pedestrian. And unless we up the level of ambition, we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, there are lots of places where coordination in itself can be useful. I mean, take the other one on transportation, autonomous vehicles, where if you need to have autonomous vehicles driving around, well, you need to negotiate with kind of Department for Transports and local councils and the police and insurers, and lots of things need to come together.
Isn't Wave coming to London, Mads?
Waymo.
Waymo.
Yes.
Yeah, Waymo.
Well, that's what the marketing is telling us, and I'm looking forward to it. I think it's terrific. But we also want Wave to accelerate, right? Kind of the homegrown tech, and we want to make it easy to experiment and deploy. And could it be useful to have somebody from central government helping to pull all these things together to make it easier for businesses to experiment? I think so. But I also think kind of the important thing here is, how can we get some of these technologies more quickly into the field? And yes, that should include both diagnostics and therapeutics.
But maybe the word should be used, which is probably a word politically dangerous, is concierge, which is which is
I can just smell Baroness Moan in the background.
I'm starting to get back. I know. But actually, there is something that basically can accelerate these technologies into the government's hands.
I think it's just, to start with, having business savvy people in Parliament, and then secondarily, maybe to your point, have people who are more technically proficient. But this just feels like a barrier.
Today, the Ministry of Justice in the UK just signed a big deal with OpenAI, which basically looks like an enterprise deal by OpenAI. So good for them.
Andrew, tell us some SF stories, because obviously, being in the land of sunshine and glory, you're gonna have all of the insights and know everything already in the 12 hours that you've been there.
Well, a bunch of Imperial founders in deep tech were at the EF office yesterday, showing their wares. Decent turnout, but yeah, not a lot to report until I start hitting the pavement today.
Yeah, get out there. Yeah, it's morning for you, isn't it, at the time of recording? Well, anything else on the government initiatives before we move on? Because I do want to talk about the 28th regime before you run out of time. Any more on this? I'm going to move swiftly on. So let's talk about the 28th regime. Now, for those that don't know what the 28th regime, a quick reminder, it's an EU-wide simplified startup entity designed to help startups operate, sell, raise cross-border. So it's a bit like a Delaware C Corp. It's a very simplistic way of having one entity, one tax regime, one option scheme, and just a very smart way of operating across Europe if you're a startup. Now, the challenge is, I've been reading this week that there is a rumor that it's going to be a directive, not a regulation. Now, that's not as bad necessarily as it sounds, but EU Inc. is pushing for a much clearer and more concise definition, and they've done all of the hard yards. So EU Inc. Now, you must look at, what's the URL? It is I think it's proposal.eu-inc.org. If you haven't, and you can see it's a Notion page, you can see that the guys over at EU Inc. have done all of the hard yards with 15,000 signatures and many legal volunteers working on this document. It's proposal.eu-inc.org. They've done the hard yards to basically be able to present before January the 15th, when this new EU Commission comes together, to get this pushed into a useful format that will really make sense for founders and startups and investors across Europe. So my question for the room is directive versus regulation. What's the difference? Does it matter? Would a directive be quicker because every country can make their own version, even though they are abiding by the essence and the major food groups within it? Is it just too much of a mess if it's a directive rather than regulation? So Lomax, do you want to kick this off?
Yeah, you're reminding me of my EU constitutional law, modules back in the day. Look, okay, so as a reminder, a regulation is something which is immediately legally binding. We have all of these member states, 27 member states. When actually this gets passed, it's immediately binding in all of the countries. The directive is the watered down version, which basically gives each individual country a timeline which to implement something, and they can do it in their own individual way. If you're serious about the 28th regime, and these guys have moved incredibly fast. This campaign's really only been going for about 12 months, and they've already got it to, they've now finished the consultation and now moving actually towards the implementation phase. If the EU is serious about this thing, then it has to be a regulation. I think it's very, very clear. For me, I don't want to pour cold water on it. I sort of feel like the status quo for us of basically investing in US, like in Delaware companies, is basically fine. Like, it's fine. Like, it's just one thing I would say. The thing for me that's the biggest problem is the ESOPs. Is the employee stock option schemes, which are all different and they all have different tax rules. And the problem is the 28th regime cannot fix the tax because each member state has their own, rules on tax. That's not a kind of EU that's delegated to each EU member state. So that's a longer burn. I'm personally more excited about a time when Europe gets its act together on the, taxation of stock option schemes. It will be great to have the single company legal entity thing.
That is all baked in.
No, it's not, because I said it's not. It's baked in on their website, but I don't think it's going to go. It's not going to be part of the first wave of changes because, as I said, it involves tax, which is absolutely an individual member state and member state thing.
But with your legal head, directives aren't as bad as this is my impression. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. They're not as bad as you might think, as per if it's regulation, it's just law, it's just how we do things around here. But directives, I got the impression that you still had to follow the directive was still available. You still followed all of the salient endpoints, so that almost the law, if you like, but you just did it in your own way that served your country. However, but the major
listen to what you're saying, Dan. You're talking about giving free rein to 27 member states to interpret the rules and implement it on their own timeline. That's never going to happen, or it's going to happen in a very watered down way. You need to tell everyone what to do. I
guess my kind of feeling behind the feeling was, if it's a directive to start with, A, it'll be quicker. B, there will be something that is legally binding that's out there, but then I don't know what mess ensues after the fact.
Look, I'm sure it's not the end of the world. This is all good direction, but I'm afraid no, it needs to be. It needs to be in European law. But as I said, I'm more excited about stock options. I personally care less about this legal entity thing.
No, I'm not with you on that one, because I want to see Europe.
I'm fine investing in Delaware C Corps. I'm actually totally fine with it. It works fine. It's quick, simple, cheap.
Europe, baby, Europe. Give me more Europe. Mads, what would you focus on?
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting discussion, and I think it's worth pointing out that yes, regulation is important here, but even that isn't magic. Kind of GDPR is the flagship regulation we've seen in the last few years. And even with that uniform GDPR, you still had 70 plus opening clauses with national kind of specifications. Germany ended up implementing more than 200 laws to tailor GDPR at a federal and local level. And because the thing is, every new law has to fit into existing law. And so you need the scaffolding. Let's say, for example, some of the financial regulation. Well, we've seen the kind of things like MiFID being kind of very esoteric financial regulation about how the financial markets should work. Well, it turns out that once you pass kind of laws around that, you need the local regulators to work with them, and they need the laws, they need the legislation to then figure out how to implement and interpret that and work in the framework of all the other laws you have. So this stuff is fiendishly complex. And I think there's a huge risk that even if the EU Inc. guys get their way and get this to regulation status, you're still going to see lots of local tailoring. It's really a can of worms. So, all kudos to them for trying. I'd say, what is the prize here? I'm not sure this is really about a European Delaware as such. I think it's probably going to be more piecemeal. But even so, if this could mean upgrading the laggards, if this could mean transforming the German corporate law to say, yes, kind of the GmbH, kind of the traditional incorporation model in Germany, the notaries, the issues you have with stock options, all that stuff, will upgrade that to a new EU model so you can choose between the two. That could unlock massive productivity gains for Germany and therefore for Europe. The European Union, the Commission is assessing that more than 2.1 billion euros a year are wasted just by admin stuff, which is a massive chunk of change when you think about it for early stage startups. I mean, think about if we had another 2 billion euros for seed stage companies in Europe, that would be meaningful. And they're assessing that 800 million of that is in Germany alone. So if this does nothing else than just fix Germany, that in itself would be huge.
It's actually a very, very good point, because if you go lowest common denominator, let's just fix this across Slovenia, Slovakia, everywhere. I mean, no disrespect to those countries, but if you just did Germany, France, and Sweden, for example, bearing in mind you think the UK is already fine, then you've been moving the needle massively.
I mean, getting rid of the need to stamp a wax seal and have your dog sign it with his paw in Germany, and then go and get the local vicar to bless it would be fantastic. But I think
are we still talking about startups?
Andreas has done an amazing job with this initiative. I mean, this is something which, if it was executed on in the right way, so it was everything you said at the top of this segment, Dan, and it was simple, and it was like a Delaware C Corp, then it would be transformative for Europe. But I doubt it's going to happen. I think we're seeing the first signs that it's going to be watered down. Just enough control will be put back in the hands of nation governments that they fuck it up, and so that it's no longer simple, and it will be a wasted opportunity. I really, really hope I'm wrong for Europe, because I don't think people understand how foundationally helpful this would be for the ecosystem and for businesses in general. But it requires an awful lot of change and an awful lot of tweaks, and for each individual country to align. And I think it's unlikely.
I am not going to end on that note. I'm going to end on a more positive note.
What I would say, so if you want to end on a positive note, is what the EU Inc. guys have done is an amazing thing.
Yeah,
actually.
Yeah.
So kudos to them.
If this can help unlock Germany, that would be huge for Europe.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that upside, little upside.
And a negative for the UK, because currently there's still great benefits to being a UK limited company. That's basically your second choice, right? If you're not going to be Delaware, US, then your best choice is UK limited. So
maybe the politicians will eventually wake up and realize what the rest of us did a long time ago, which we should rejoin, the sooner the better.
Oh my goodness, that's a whole podcast in itself. Right, Lomax, you've got a deal of the week for us before we tail off.
Well, deal of the week, and actually lots to pick from, because I think Revolut is supposed to be raising money at 75 billion. Wave is supposed to be raising a massive 2 billion, I think they raised 1 billion last year, didn't they? So Wave is on doing great things, and only entered the Japanese market 6 months ago. And I was already watching a video of the founder and Masa navigating the narrow streets in Tokyo. So good for them. But deal of the week has to be CoalMine, which is I guess you call it a health tech company. I think they have aspirations more in the kind of BCI, like brain computer interface space. I guess you could call it a sort of non-invasive Neuralink for Europe is how you could pitch it. So they just raised $102 million, led by Plural. well, how would you describe Plural? I think they describe themselves as the Founders Fund for Europe, but they just raised $100 million Series A, I guess. A company founded in 2018. And CoalMine at the moment is very focused on health, right? So a bit like Neuralink.
Yeah.
So
Zeitgeisty.
they have a non-invasive brain monitoring device that uses low-power infrared light and optical sensors to measure cerebral blood flow, intracranial pressure, and autoregulation. This will be a medical device. It needs to go through FDA in the US. That's what the use of proceeds are. These clinical trials are very expensive. I think CoalMine has aspirations for a sort of broader non-medical use case on BCI, but we'll see. But that's a big raise.
Nice. So UK-based health tech. Loving it. CoalMine, go for it. Gents, traveling Wilburys, look after yourselves, get some sleep. This has been Upside. We'll catch you next week.
Bye.
See you next week. Bye,
Ciao,
guys.
ciao.